You're listening to Reformed Thinking.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we unpack complex ideas and make them accessible for you. Today, we're taking a really close look at a foundational Hebrew term you find all over the Old Testament. Show you. This deep dive is, well, it's all about understanding what this word means, where it pops up, and what it tells us about biblical thought. We're going to pull back the layers on a concept that maybe at first glance seems pretty straightforward, maybe just means bad guy. But, as we'll discover, it holds some surprising depth and real consequences for understanding justice, morality, and even God's own character in the Old Testament story.
Indeed. And we're going to look into the nuances of Heza, trying to move beyond just a simple kind of surface level translation. We want to grasp its full range of meaning from, direct legal guilt to a more general state of, let's say, unrighteousness before God. Our sources for this are, well, a pretty rich collection of biblical lexicon, some in-depth theological studies, and analyses of how the word is actually used. So that should give us a fairly comprehensive view of this concept. Our mission really is to shed some light on this crucial term, showing how it shapes our understanding of right and wrong and the very nature of human character and divine standards in the biblical texts. It's a word that truly defines a central biblical split, a dichotomy, and we want to help you see its shape, its contours more clearly.
Okay, let's dig into this. When we first run into Hedda in the Old Testament, what's the core understanding? Is it really just bad, or does it carry a particular kind of weight that sets it apart? What's the foundational sense the biblical authors are trying to get across when they use this word?
Well, the fundamental sense of qwepet, it really centers on two ideas that are closely related but maybe a little distinct. Wickedness and guilt. It's a foundational concept. It describes a specific moral and spiritual standing, one that isn't arbitrary or, it's fleeting. This term, it's not a casual label. It carries considerable weight and a kind of finality in biblical discussion, often indicating a settled state of being rather than, say, just a momentary lapse. Something that's helpful to understand right off the bat is that it operates in Hebrew as both an adjective and a substantive meaning. It can also function as a noun. So when it's used as an adjective, it means wicked or unrighteous. This describes a person who is morally bad in principle or practice. So it's not just about a single action that might be regrettable. It seems to point more to a person's inherent character or disposition. For instance, you look at Job 20.29, the text speaks of the portion of a wicked person. See, this isn't just about what someone does, but about who they are and the sort of inescapable consequences that flow from that identity. The term characterizes an inner state, a disposition towards unrighteousness that, well, inevitably shows up in outward behavior. It suggests a pattern, really, and a fundamental orientation that runs counter to what's considered upright and just in God's sight. It's a deep-seated thing, not superficial. Then, as a substantive, it refers to a wicked person, an evildoer, or sometimes just the guilty. In this form, it often names a distinct class of individuals within society or, before God. For example, Ezekiel 3.18 uses it when God commands the prophet to speak to the wicked. Here, the wicked refers to those who are known for their evil ways, a group identified by their consistent turning away from God's moral standards. This highlights that Hekea can categorize a whole segment of humanity, those who are defined by their persistent wrongdoing and moral failings. It signifies a distinct group whose actions and orientation are contrary to the divine will. Now, a crucial aspect here, and one that really gives Heke its unique punch, is the certainty it conveys. When this term describes a person or an action, it suggests that their guilt is, well, certain, or the behavior has been unquestionably established as wrong. It's not about simple mistakes or actions that might be ambiguous, where there's maybe room for doubt or mitigating circumstances. No. Instead, it signifies a clear, undeniable transgression, a definite deviation from the expected norm or the divine standard. This isn't some vague idea of misbehavior. It's a pronounced, established wrongdoing that leaves no doubt about its nature. It communicates a kind of conclusive verdict on someone's moral standing or an action's ethical value, leaving little room for argument or ambiguity.
That's a powerful distinction. So it's not just someone who made a mistake, something that might be forgiven or maybe overlooked. It's more like someone whose wrong is definitively known, with a certainty that implies a kind of settled state of culpability. That truly adds weight to the term, doesn't it? Suggesting a clear, undeniable responsibility rather than just an unfortunate error. It speaks to a settled state, a character, not just a fleeting misstep. So I'm curious then, how does this core meaning, this certainty, how does it show up when we look at specific contexts, especially, say, in legal settings?
Right, that's exactly the next layer to peel back. The certainty becomes strikingly clear when we look at its legal or, forensic use. In this context, marks someone as guilty of an individual crime or simply in the wrong in a legal dispute. It describes someone who has an unrighteous cause, meaning their side of the legal case is fundamentally unjust or is legally not innocent of a violation of law. This is really where the term moves from a general moral descriptor to a specific actionable legal verdict within the ancient Israelite judicial system. You can kind of picture the scene, right? A public court in ancient Israel. When a person was labeled epi in a legal sense, it wasn't just a casual insult. It meant they had been formally found liable for their actions, having committed a demonstrable offense against the law or against another person. Think about Exodus 23:7, where the text gives this clear command against justifying the wicked in a legal proceeding. Don't declare the guilty innocent. This shows how Eki is directly tied to judicial outcomes and the whole process of figuring out guilt or innocence. It's about a specific legal finding, a formal determination of wrongdoing that demands a just response from the legal system. It really underscores that justice, in the biblical framework, means clearly distinguishing between the guilty and the innocent. Now, here's where this legal sense gets particularly, well, stark. One of the most striking applications is the phrase, me arasha lamut. This translates literally as, so guilty that he must die, or simply, guilty of death. Numbers 35.31 uses this phrase to signify a crime severe enough to warrant capital punishment, indicating undeniable absolute culpability. This isn't about a minor infraction or even a serious one that might be fixed through restitution or something. It signifies a transgression that carries the most extreme penalty possible within their legal system, a judgment of ultimate severity. It literally means the person's actions have put them in a position where death is the just and necessary consequence, a direct result of their definitive guilt. And the sources also point to other problematic legal actions, things that are condemned precisely because they twist justice. These include acquitting the wicked, which is aphi in Hebrew, meaning declaring a guilty person innocent, and also saying to the wicked, you are righteous, declaring a wicked person is actually in the right. Both of these actions are presented as severe deviations from true justice. They're condemned because they distort how the legal system is supposed to work. They blur the lines between right and wrong, and they fail to uphold the righteous standards of divine law. To acquit the wicked is, in the biblical view, to defy the very nature of justice and basically condone wrongdoing, which the biblical framework consistently, vehemently opposes. It's seen as a perversion of the court's sacred duty.
Wow. That phrase, guilty of death, that certainly brings a sharp clarity to the consequences of being identified as Cath. It moves beyond just abstract theology to literal life and death situations, doesn't it? So it's not just a moral failing then, but one with concrete legal standing and often dire, inescapable results. Okay, so if this term is so precise in a courtroom setting, how does it then broaden out into the wider moral and spiritual landscape of biblical thought? Does it keep that same intensity?
That's a crucial shift to understand because definitely extends beyond the confines of a legal courtroom. It carries significant moral and theological weight throughout the Old Testament. In this broader sense, it characterizes someone guilty in general, essentially, before God. This refers to a wicked person or an evildoer in a more spiritual sense, indicating a disposition that runs fundamentally contrary to the very character and holiness of God himself. It's not just about breaking a specific rule that you could argue about in court, but about a fundamental misalignment with divine standards and a kind of pervasive unrighteousness that marks one's spiritual standing. The term applies to those described as impious or godless. These are individuals who lack reverence for God, who disregard spiritual matters, or who actively oppose divine authority. Their lives demonstrate a fundamental disrespect for the Creator. This moral and theological sense, it extends to individuals who show hostility to God or his people, functioning as wicked enemies. Isaiah 26.0 gives a vivid picture of this, depicting those whose actions and attitudes are actively adversarial to God's plans and his covenant people. They aren't merely indifferent to God, they're antagonistic, actively working against divine purposes. This broad application includes individuals who resist obeying civil or religious laws, or who deliberately oppose God's standard for righteous or good behavior. Malachi 3.18, for instance, mentions those not serving YHWH as being contrasted with the righteous. This underscores that a refusal to honor and obey God's commands or to disregard his covenant name and character places one squarely in the category of ekeh. And this isn't just about ignorance or weakness, it's often portrayed as active resistance or pervasive neglect of divine requirements. In essence, it marks someone guilty of sin, whether against God's direct commandments or against human standards that are meant to reflect God's moral order. It encompasses a pervasive guilt, a spiritual state of being out of step with the divine will, demonstrating an ongoing pattern of rebellion or neglect.
Right. So if I'm hearing you correctly, it seems to describe not just a single wrong action or even a string of bad choices, but a pervasive state or orientation toward God's ways. It sounds like a characteristic of one's entire being and approach to life, almost a complete picture of rebellion or disregard, not just a snapshot of a bad moment. That makes the term incredibly significant within the Old Testament's ethical framework, doesn't it? It sets up a very clear distinction.
Yes, you've captured it perfectly. That's a central insight. The concept of is almost always presented in direct contrast to ṣaddiq, which means righteous or just. This fundamental opposition forms a central dichotomy in biblical thought. It's a clear division between two distinct ways of living, two spiritual orientations, and ultimately, two paths of relating to God. It highlights a kind of binary choice and a clear separation of outcomes, leaving very little room for ambiguity in moral standing. This contrast is laid out clearly in numerous biblical texts, serving as a foundational framework for understanding human character and divine judgment. For example, back in Genesis 18, verses 23 and 25, as Abraham is pleading for Sodom and Gomorrah, he talks about the righteous with wicked. That's the. He draws a sharp distinction between the innocent and the culpable, appealing to God's justice to differentiate between them. Later, Malachi 3.18 draws a distinct line between righteous and wicked, Pharaoh's view, indicating a clear moral and spiritual differentiation that God himself will highlight and act upon. Job 9.2 also presents the pairing blameless and wicked, showcasing how these two terms are consistently used to classify individuals based on their fundamental moral standing. This pairing consistently highlights two distinct types of individuals or states of being in the world, underscoring that in this core biblical classification, there really isn't a fuzzy middle ground. And this distinction gets elaborated even further through the concept of the way or the path. The way of the wicked or way is a frequent and honestly quite stark concept, consistently contrasted with the path of the righteous. Psalm 1.6, for example, makes this crystal clear. YHWH watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. See, this isn't just descriptive. It's a pronouncement of divine judgment and ultimate outcome. Proverbs 4.19 similarly illustrates the stark difference in lifestyle and eventual outcome, describing the path of the wicked as darkness, contrasting it with the radiant light that guides the righteous. It's a whole life trajectory, not just a single step. Habakkuk 1.13 even paints this visceral picture of the wicked swallowing up the righteous, illustrating the theological conflict and the tension between these two opposing forces in the world. It's a tension that cries out for divine intervention and ultimate justice. So this contrast, it's not merely descriptive, it's prescriptive, shaping how the audience should think about their own lives in alignment with God's standards.
It's truly a very clear binary, isn't it? This biblical distinction between those who follow God's standards and those who oppose them, it really sets up a fundamental framework for understanding human behavior and divine judgment within the Old Testament story. And given how central this concept feels, I'm curious about its prevalence. How often does A actually appear in the Old Testament? And are there specific books or periods where we see it show up more frequently than others? Knowing its distribution might give us a feel for where these ideas were most developed or emphasized.
That's a great question, and the data here is quite telling, actually. Epe appears 263 or 264 times in the Old Testament, depending on which manuscript tradition you follow. So it's a truly significant term by any measure, and its distribution is anything but uniform across the books. This provides valuable insight into the periods and genres that focused most intensely on this concept. This uneven spread is meaningful in itself, suggesting maybe shifts in theological thought or emphasis over time. It's most frequent in specific books, largely falling within what we call wisdom literature and certain prophetic books. For example, the Psalms contain the highest concentration, with Sev appearing 82 times. Wow. This really highlights the psalmist's constant wrestling with the pervasive presence of wickedness in the world, the suffering it causes the righteous, and that unwavering conviction in God's ultimate justice and his eventual judgment of the wicked. You see it in the laments, the prayers for deliverance, the affirmations of divine sovereignty. They all really hinge on this distinction. Then, in Proverbs, the term is found 78 times, showing its central role in the practical teachings of wisdom. Proverbs often presents these clear, sometimes stark contrasts between the wise and the foolish, the righteous and the wicked, underscoring the different paths they walk and the very different outcomes they experience. The book uses pakas to describe those whose choices lead to ruin, contrasting them sharply with the blessed path of those who cling to wisdom and the fear of YHWH. Moving on. In the prophetic book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel occurs 28 times, placing it as a key term in his powerful messages, especially during the exile. Ezekiel, ministering during the Babylonian exile, frequently addresses the guilt and rebellion of Israel and also other nations. The term here often applies to those who are stubborn, unrepentant, and resistant to God's warnings and his call to righteousness. It's almost like a tool for diagnostic assessment of their spiritual state before judgment falls. And finally, in Job, it's used 26 times, another significant concentration in wisdom literature. The book of Job, as you know, grapples with that enduring, difficult question of why the wicked sometimes prosper and the righteous suffer. This makes the definition and identification of ik absolutely critical to the philosophical and theological arguments that unfold throughout that whole narrative. So these four books, Psalms, Proverbs, Ezekiel, and Job, they account for a substantial majority of the total occurrences. It shows precisely where the biblical writers most intensely engaged with the concept of eke and its ramifications. And interestingly, the sources note that eke was relatively rare before exile. It primarily appears in texts dating from the exilic and post-exilic periods, or those reflecting wisdom traditions that really flourished during and after the exile. This is often noted succinctly as chiefly as Wislet, Ezekiel, Psalms, and wisdom literature. This suggests a pivotal shift, maybe. The experience of national catastrophe, the loss of the land, the destruction of the temple, this likely forced Israel into deep introspection about corporate and individual guilt and righteousness. This period of intense theological reflection seems to have really brought the concept of fae to the forefront, maybe as a way to understand their circumstances and God's justice in the midst of it all. You see, its appearances are much less frequent in other parts of the Old Testament. For instance, the Pentateuch and the historical books from Genesis through 1 Kings, they only have it about 15 times combined. Isaiah uses it 11 times, Jeremiah only 5 times. Kohelet or Ecclesiastes has it 7 times, and Daniel and 2 Chronicles each have it twice. So while the term is present throughout, its concentrated usage in certain periods and genres points to a specific historical and theological development in how wickedness was understood and discussed, particularly in light of Israel's covenant relationship with YHWH and the consequences of disobedience.
That's really fascinating insight. So while the idea of wickedness is certainly present across the Old Testament, its, let's say, articulation and discussion truly crystallize and appear much more often in certain periods and types of writings, particularly as God's people dealt with the trauma of exile and sought deep wisdom for their path forward. It almost seems like the national crisis and the subsequent introspection profoundly sharpened the focus on this moral category, making it a lens through which they understood their past, present, and future. Okay, so when the biblical authors use this term, do they often pair it with other specific words or phrases? Things that might give us an even more detailed picture of what F looks like in, daily life or thought.
Absolutely. That's a great observation. The biblical authors frequently use Torah within recurring phrases, and these paint a fuller picture of this type of individual. It's not just an abstract concept, but someone whose presence and influence are tangible in the world. These common associations further illustrate the concept, giving it depth beyond just the single word and revealing consistent themes about the life and influence of the wicked. These aren't just random pairings, they reveal consistent themes about the life and influence of the wicked. One very common phrase is hat-shuren. This means the plan, counsel, or company of sinners or the wicked. Psalm 1.1, a foundational text, opens by stating, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked." This suggests that even the advice, the strategic thinking, or simply the social circle of the wicked is distinct and frankly detrimental. It implies that aligning yourself with the wicked, even just in thought or association, leads to negative outcomes. Their very thoughts and intentions are marked by their unrighteousness, and their influence can easily draw others astray. We also frequently find phrases like extra's guilty way, or exshigre's guilty way, or exshigre, the way of the wicked sinners. Proverbs 15.9 notes, "The way of the wicked is an abomination to YHWH," and Psalm 1.6, as we mentioned, tells us that the way of the wicked will perish. These phrases exemplify this, showing wickedness not just as isolated acts, but as a characteristic lifestyle or a consistent path of behavior. It's not just an occasional stumble or a momentary deviation, it's a consistent trajectory of life that is fundamentally contrary to God's will and leads to destruction. Their entire mode of living is defined by this term, a deliberate choice of path that diverges from righteousness. Furthermore, you see Ekshik-Ake, house of the wicked. This appears in texts like Micah 6.10, referring to the house of the wicked, and Proverbs 14.11 states, "The house of the wicked will be overthrown." Well, this refers not just to a physical building, but metaphorically to the family, the lineage, or even the generational legacy associated with wickedness. It implies that their unrighteousness can pervade their entire domestic and communal sphere. It speaks to a collective identity, and often a collective destiny, shaped by this characteristic, underscoring how deeply rooted wickedness can become. Another fascinating phrase is, no limp of the wicked. This is found in Job 21.7 and Proverbs 13.9. It's a metaphorical expression, often hinting at their fleeting prosperity or their eventual demise. For example, Proverbs 13.9 says, "The lamp of the wicked will be put out." In the ancient world, a lamp symbolized life, vitality, prosperity, maybe even guidance and legacy. So its extinction for the wicked forecasts a pretty grim end to their apparent success, no matter how bright it might seem for a time. It serves as a stark reminder that any temporary prosperity they enjoy is ultimately unsustainable, fragile, and destined to fade away. And finally, we encounter collective terms like kokari shivere, meaning all the godless sinners of the earthland. You see this in Psalm 75.9 and 101.8. Psalm 75.9 mentions all the wicked of the earth, indicating a broad category of those who are morally and spiritually corrupt across a given territory or even the entire world. These collective terms show that ite isn't limited to individual cases, but can apply to entire societies, populations, or even nations whose collective actions and orientation are opposed to God's standards of justice and righteousness.
Wow, yeah. These crazes really give us more than just snapshots. They provide a pretty comprehensive portrait of it's like their thoughts, their actions, their very environment, even their perceived prosperity. It all bears the unmistakable mark of this term. It illustrates that aggress is a really comprehensive descriptor, affecting pretty much every facet of a person's life and influence. So given this detailed understanding, can you give us some specific, concrete examples from the Old Testament narratives, like individuals or groups who are specifically identified this way? It always helps to put a face, or maybe a nation, to the concept.
Certainly. And while the term primarily points to character, as we've said, certain historical figures and groups are explicitly labeled quada in the Old Testament. These provide tangible examples of what this concept looks like in practice, illustrating the concrete application of the term in various historical contexts. They show us who the biblical writers considered to embody this characteristic. Okay, a prime example is Pharaoh, the Egyptian king in the book of Exodus. In Exodus 9.27, after a series of devastating plagues, Pharaoh himself actually confesses, "YHWH is righteous, and I and my people are wicked Ekarit." He's identified as Kako because of his persistent defiance against God and his severe oppressive actions against the Israelites, refusing to let them go despite repeated divine warnings and judgments. His consistent refusal, even with overwhelming evidence of God's power, marked him as definitively wicked, not just politically stubborn, but spiritually hostile. His actions were a direct affront to God's will and his covenant people. Moving on in history, Babylon is another significant example. Isaiah 13.11 and 14.5 describe Babylon as, "This indicates its wicked and oppressive nature, particularly concerning its actions against God's people, Judah, by conquering them and forcing them into exile." Now, although Babylon was sometimes used as an instrument of divine judgment against Judah's own sin, its own arrogance, its ruthless cruelty, and widespread idolatry eventually led to its condemnation as a wicked entity. It exceeded its divine mandate, so to speak, and would face its own judgment. Similarly, the Chaldeans, who were the dominant people group of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, are referred to as Habakkuk in Habakkuk 1.4 and 13. This highlights their cruelty, their disregard for justice, and their unrighteousness as they became instruments of destruction and conquest. The prophet Habakkuk wrestles with God, allowing such a wicked nation to oppress Judah, crying out against their violence and lack of justice. Their military might and expansion were seen as fundamentally unrighteous because they disregarded justice and divine standards in their conquests, acting with unbridled aggression. And then, closer home for Israel, within their own community, we have the Korahites. In number 16.26, Moses explicitly calls Korah's rebellious group a penker, the wicked men. This signifies their rebellious and sinful nature against divine authority and the established leadership of Moses and Aaron. Their challenge to God's chosen leaders was viewed as a direct rebellion against God himself, making them prime examples of internal individuals whose defiance brought about swift and severe divine judgment. It's also worth noting that Achan, though maybe less commonly, described Gentiles who oppress Israelites. This highlights their unrighteous cause or hostile actions towards God's chosen people. This isn't about their ethnicity as such, but about their behavior, their political and military posture, and their active opposition to God's covenant people. Ultimately, though, and this is crucial for all these examples, YHWH, the God of Israel, serves the ultimate standard of righteousness. The Peh is the one who acts against this divine standard or is judged by it, being guilty essentially before God in their character and actions, whether they are an individual, a family, or an entire nation.
So it's not only a description of individual moral choices, but also a way to label collective opposition to God and his people, whether Israelite or Gentile. It really frames the struggle between good and evil in both personal and geopolitical terms. It gives the term a pretty broad canvas of application. Okay, to really round out our understanding of I think it's helpful to see how other languages grappled with translating this multifaceted concept. How did the earliest Greek translators of the Hebrew Bible handle keza when they produced the Septuagint? Did they find one word? War.
That's a perceptive line of inquiry, definitely. Because seeing how early translators wrestled with this concept offers another lens on its core meaning and its various nuances. The Septuagint, or LXX, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, translates Peh using a few key Greek terms, and each one highlights a distinct facet of the original Hebrew word. This provides another really rich layer to our understanding. The most common translation they used is esbis. This basically means impious or ungodly. This term is used approximately 142 times in the LXX for SB. This shows a strong, quite deliberate emphasis on a lack of reverence or devotion towards God as a central aspect of wickedness. Someone described as SB is fundamentally someone who disregards divine authority, who lacks proper fear or respect for God, or who actively acts contrary to divine will. This really highlights the theological dimension of as fundamentally opposed to God's character and demands, emphasizing a kind of spiritual alienation from the Creator. Another significant translation is hamartulos. This means sinful or simply a sinner. It appears around 72 times in the Septuagint as a translation for axero. This points directly to the idea of transgression, of falling short of a standard, and hamartulos is someone who commits specific acts of sin, who misses the mark of God's perfect law, or who deviates from the path of righteousness. This translation brings out the aspect of ekthad that relates to violating specific commandments and moral guidelines, emphasizing the culpability that arises from such transgressions and the inherent brokenness that comes with them. And finally, they used animos, which means lawless, about 31 times. This highlights the disregard for or even active opposition to established divine or human law. And Thamos is someone who lives without regard for law or even actively against it, someone who thrives in chaos and rejects order. This translation underscores those forensic and legal aspects of Epheth that we talked about earlier, portraying the wicked as those who reject order and embrace chaos, whether in the civil sphere of society or in defiance of divine statutes. It connects wickedness directly to rebellion against established moral and legal structures.
Wow. What's fascinating here is how these different Greek terms chosen by those early translators, they collectively confirm the really multifaceted nature of F. It truly seems to capture concepts of ungodliness, sinfulness, and disregard for law, all wrapped up in that one powerful Hebrew term. This multi-layered translation gives us an even fuller appreciation for what the biblical writers are conveying, showing that this concept is rich and layered, encompassing various dimensions of moral and spiritual deviation. It's really a master key for unlocking deeper understanding. Well, our deep dive into Esh truly illustrates how a single word can open up a whole world of meaning within the biblical texts, challenging us to look beyond simple definitions. From its strict legal sense of being guilty of death to its broader description of those who are fundamentally hostile to God and his ways, this term is absolutely central to understanding biblical ethics, judgment, and the profound distinctions presented in Scripture. It's a foundational concept, really, that helps us grasp the deep contrast between righteousness and unrighteousness in Scripture.
It really does. It makes us consider that stark contrast presented throughout Scripture between those who walk in unrighteousness and those who strive for a just path. This concept of isn't merely an abstract theological idea, it's a living descriptor that shapes our understanding of divine justice and human responsibility. And this raises an important question for you, our listener, as you reflect on all this. How might recognizing the full scope of its legal weight, its moral breadth, its clear opposition to righteousness, how might that shape your reading of Psalms or Proverbs or the prophetic books as you encounter these discussions of human character and divine standards? How does seeing this comprehensive picture of wickedness maybe sharpen your understanding of God's persistent call to righteousness in every aspect of life? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Peh. We hope this has given you some fresh clarity and perhaps a richer understanding of a vital biblical concept. Until next time, keep seeking.
You've been listening to The Deep Dive. Find more episodes at podcast website platform info.